we see this militarization of the government as well. From day one, we had 13 top cabinet members as military individuals, right, military men, out of a ministry of a cabinet of 22. Now, having fired a couple of the civilians serving in the presidential staff, only one civilian is in the presidential staff, and all of the others are generals. This is not a campaign against generals servicing in office, but I'm just trying to highlight, the number of generals serving in top ministries. In addition to that, about 41 agencies of the federal government are now head by military individuals, and there are numbers of people monitoring this, saying that it goes actually over 100 generals in charge of different agencies of the government. This is a picture beyond that, sort of people serving in the executive branch, of the militarization, increasing militarizations of schools in Brazil. This is a picture of children, of course, right, in military uniform in a school in Brasília, the federal district in Brazil. This is a new thing, a partnership that the public schooling in the capital city have done with the military to bring this militarized style, right, to schools in Brazil. And in addition to that, of course, we have to remember, and we have Bolsonaro on the extreme right, and his son, senator, on the left here, and all the people in between them, the two of them, right, the four individuals in the middle there, they're members of this paramilitary group in Rio, which we call milícias, right? Just to highlight, and there are a lot of conversations about this, right, the proximity, how close this family, the Bolsonaro family, has been, even though, of course, they deny it now, of these paramilitary groups in Brazil now. Okay, with all of that, what can be done? So where could we put to resist some of these things, besides having this sort of events, which I think is a great start? Artists are, once again, as in the late 60s in Brazil, leading some of that effort. We have the launching of a movie about this guerrilla man in Brazil in the 60s, Marighella. So the name of the movie is Marighella, and this is Wagner Montes, the gentleman holding that plaque, launching the movie in Berlin last week. And he really came out strongly saying, we need to be active in resisting the policies of this government. And he's holding this plate with the name of Marielle Franco, the councilwoman in Rio that was killed almost a year ago. In 2 weeks will be a year ago, and we still don't know, we don't have any sense of, we're going to ever know who killed them, even though there's a lot of signs pointing to this militia group here that was behind the assassination of Marielle Franco. Right? So artists are leading the way. As I mentioned before, there are some cracks in the media, as I mentioned before, that are highlighting some of these things of the inherent problems of the coalition. Yesterday, a poll came out saying that 39% of Brazilians only, so 39 is a very low estimate, right, approve the government as it is so far, even though personally, Bolsonaro has found 57% approval. So there's a difference between personal approval and government approval, but still, right, those are some numbers that perhaps are a little heartwarming, somewhat. In Congress, we might assume that this policies for this very harsh, public safety program and the end of Social Security as we know it may be tamed. So there will be some resistance in Congress, but that's to be seen. I'm being a little over-optimistic on that. There's diffused sense of resistance in society, but still we don't have some sort of coalesced movement to that, and we certainly lack a leadership to do that. Maybe unions now are saying they're going to mobilize strongly against this Social Security reform, so that might be a place to look. But again, so far we've seen some elements, but very, very fragmented, unfortunately. And then the last slide I would have, and then I will end, is we also count a lot on international solidarity. And I would include this event as part of this conversation, at least to bring awareness and to be aware, in a reflection of what's going on. And we do have this movement now in the US, and similar organizations do exist in France, in England. This is a US-based network for democracy in Brazil, which already has several chapters in different states of the country, largely led by activists and academics. So many universities have a chapter on that. We are putting together a chapter here at the U. Some individuals in this room are members of this. So I just want to highlight that people also outside of Brazil are certainly paying attention to this and trying to, when I mean resistance, I mean, of course, in a loose sense, right? I'm meaning to bring awareness and conversation and denouncement of these things and to at least have an eye on this. And for that matter, I very much appreciate the opportunity and your being here today.
Great, thank you, Rafael. It looks to me like we have lunch. Yes, Erika. Did you want to ask a question?
Yes, I just wanted to ask What was the role of the Lava Jato case in actually sinking the Labor Party and maybe lifting the Bolsonaro's
Sure.
position?
Sure. Do you want to talk about that?
No, later.
Yeah. Well, I think it was huge. It was decisive, I would say, right? In tarnishing the image of the Labour Party, and of course under Moro, the investigations that Moro carried out in ultimately bringing Lula to arresting Lula. So I think it was decisive.
Are you going to talk about the party system?
It was extremely politicized, extremely selective in what was being pursued rather than other accusations against other parties and other politicians. So for that matter, extremely important.
And Marco's going to cover a little bit more in depth on the party system, and that's one element of how the party system has changed and politics. So let's take a 2-minute break so that you all can get fed, because I know that there will be a riot if I make you listen to me and maybe Marco without actually feeding you. So please, there's pizza, some drinks. You know what? Let's just while they're doing, we'll switch over to this.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's easier. And then, so we take students down. Steven did it last year, and we go down and we teach a course in Brazil, in Rio, which is not a terrible place to have to spend a couple weeks over your summer. And then we bring some Brazilian students into the class from PUC, the Catholic University in Rio. And it's a very kind of interesting interaction and useful. It's 2 weeks, and you get 4 credits for an inter-term course. And in the past, we've been able to get plenty of funding for students. Of the students who are here, any interest in doing that? Should we run it again? Hustle to get the funding to make sure it's possible? Yeah, I see some nodding. Interest? Yeah? All right. And I do ask, and it's open to grad students, and then we let some undergrads in last year too. I do ask because we've had trouble getting students. I know that DU's super expensive, and so even though we were able to fund a lot of the travel, it's sort of the opportunity cost of not working over the summer for that time, and it's a hit for folks, so I do appreciate that. But if we can get a critical mass of students, 5 to 10 students, then it's worth running the course. But if we can't, then we go to Brazil anyway. I do my research, Rafael goes to see his family, but it's nice to go with students and spend some time. So I saw a few nodding.
Steven can promote it.
Steven can promote it. It didn't suck, right? Living a block from the beach in Rio, I mean, not so bad. How many, if I saw Caio raise his hand, how many hands are people who are at least interested? All right, well, we'll hold the information session probably next week, right? Because it's already starting to be March. Let's see if we get
most like I tell my students as well.
Yeah. We'll come up with a flyer, and sure, Marco is teaching in a Latin American politics class. Yeah. All right. Well, hopefully we can get that critical mass. We'll see about making it happen. Good. All right. So, what's happening in Brazil and international political economy? You all are really lucky because you have 2 real Brazilian experts, Rafael and Marco, who are in touch with the day-to-day in Brazil, really follow it closely, care deeply about their country, are real experts, top historians of Brazil and top political scientists in Brazil that are here with us. And so I'm someone who is very interested in Brazil, and I'm going to try to give a little bit of a 1,000-foot view of what I see going on, more of a political economy of sort of the last 15, 20 years, and where Bolsonaro fits in, but also sort of where Brazil fits in Latin America. And so it's going to be a slightly different presentation. I did get a question to refer to Lava Jato, the particular series of court cases, and how that's influenced politics. I'll say a little bit about that in the context of Bolsonaro and the most recent election, and also the trends across Latin America. Marco's going to speak in some detail about politics and the party system and the judiciary, I guess, in terms of its intersection with politics. So you get some more of that. So what's happening in Brazil and international political economy? If anybody ever wants to reach me, that's my email. If we start looking, in the 1990s, 2000, there was a period of extended and accelerated growth in Brazil. Really, the longest period of sustained growth And as I'll show as Rafael showed, and I'll show in terms of some of the public policies, really the first time in Brazil's history, Brazil has gone through a number of different booms and busts of very rapid growth, but never in Brazil's history was there growth with inclusion. We're really including addressing issues of inequality, social policy, and social inclusion. And so this period of growth that begins in the mid-2000s to really take off. There's some recovery of growth in the 1990s, but it really takes off in the 2000s. And on the right, we have GDP in purchasing power parity. You can see that sharp angle up. And the darker line, the solid line there, is the 4-year moving average. And so you can sort of see how it starts to angle up more steeply in that second half of the 2000s. But there is a lining on this growth story, and that is that after 50 years really of struggle to change structurally the economy of Brazil, the structure of where production happens, what kinds of production are happening, what kinds of exports really dominate the export income of Brazil, the export revenues of Brazil, to achieve manufacturing export status, to be one of the really leading manufacturing exporters in the world. That status was lost in the mid-2000s, and of course we know that commodity prices boomed. Brazil is very rich in commodities, but there were a series of policies in the 1990s and extended through the 2000s that deindustrialized Brazil, that lost many of the infrastructure capacities that Brazil had built up over that 50-year period to really achieve that kind of structural change. That was lost in the 1990s and in the 2000s. Commodities took over as the main, a driver of the Brazilian economy and Brazilian growth. And so this is part of what was going on in this period that we have to keep in mind. And I'll say more about this in class terms and structural terms in a second. But just to note that there was fast growth, but that growth was now dominated by commodities. And as I mentioned, and as Rafael has indicated with the Gini indicators that he showed, there was an effort at social inclusion. And these were explicit efforts. These were public policies. It wasn't sort of an accidental trickle down of the growth strategy. It was an explicit policy of the government, especially in the years of the Workers' Party. On the top left, we have federal government social spending, and we can see it angling up in absolute terms and as a percentage of GDP over time. At the bottom left is the minimum wage, and the red are the annual increases, and you can see a number of significant annual increases, but a steady increase over time in the minimum wage. And the minimum wage is especially important for the lower middle class and the poor, but especially the lower middle class, and also everyone else whose income is indexed to the minimum wage, like people who are on pensions. But it's those folks who are paid salaries that are indexed to the minimum wage, and when the minimum wage is increased, and your salary is written as 1 minimum wage or 2 minimum wages for a domestic servant, or for someone who's a public, works in the public sector in some menial job. Those kinds of people really saw their incomes rise, and we saw people really rising out of poverty and into what can be considered the lower middle class in terms of consumption and status. And there were a whole series of other sorts of inclusive policies, like opening up universities, increasing the number of universities, and therefore the seats at universities, and affirmative action policies at universities to bring this population really into what is public life and a full experience of citizenship as far as income and education and the life of the country. And on the right we have the unemployment rate and in particular the informality rate, which is the lighter blue line on top. And you can see how that dipped also. And in Latin America and developing countries in general, the informal sector is large. And if you can address the kinds of working lives and the poverty experienced by people in that informal sector, then you really do change the experiences of people who are at that poverty line, just below it or just above it. And so addressing issues of informality by formalizing work, making people actually work on contracts, and employers offer contracts to people and enforcing those contracts, along with the benefits that come along with that, health, pensions, and other sorts of social protections, really makes a difference in the lives of those people who rise out of poverty, enter that lower middle class, and have a completely different experience of what it is to be a citizen in this period. And so growth, social inclusion, but we did see there's a hint that there are some weaknesses in the patterns of growth, and these weaknesses become particularly evident after 2012 or so, 2012, 2013. Now, Brazil weathers the 2008-2009 financial crisis that hits the north. So Brazil, like other emerging economies, ends up weathering that. There's a moment, and you can see these growth rates here, growth rate 2000 to 2016. You do see a dip in that 2008-2009 period, but Brazil recovers quickly. But then we can see that by 2012, it started to really taper off, and then, by 2014, 2015, we're in negative territory. So the growth stops. And at least part of the explanation for the stop in this growth is the knock-on effect, as I understand, the macroeconomic effect of what happened in 2008, 2009, which, as a result of the way in which China changes its model, the US changes its model, we see commodity prices plummet. So this is this super cycle, they call it, of commodity prices on the top right. And so commodity prices, which had risen over this period in the 2000s, really making possible the kind of growth with inclusion that we see in Brazil, it falls off. When the bottom falls off of commodity prices, this really pokes a hole in what Brazil had set up as the system of growth and inclusion that was during these years, and they don't have a response. They don't have a response. They try a couple of policy responses, but those policy responses fail. And in fact, they turn to possibly the worst policy response, which is the policy response that they now are continuing with, which is a fiscal adjustment. And so Dilma starts with the fiscal adjustment. So I think some of the blame for the sharpness of the downturn that probably wasn't necessary at the time that it begins does land on her shoulders. But she is impeached. In part because the fiscal adjustment wasn't enough for some sectors. They wanted more. And so they impeach her so that they can impose more fiscal adjustment. On the left here, we have the percentage cuts in all of the different ministries, and it ranges from 63% in the Ministry of Tourism to almost 20% in the Ministry of Education. But all of the ministries in 2017 are seeing their budgets being cut. And this is the kind of fiscal adjustment that none of the northern countries underwent when they experienced their financial crisis of 2008, 2009, but southern countries, developing countries, and Brazil has adopted this wholeheartedly, have believed that austerity is the way in which you respond to a downturn in growth and the kind of slowdown that they witnessed. And from all I can tell, and from the growth numbers, it doesn't work. It's not working in Europe. Where it's being imposed on southern European countries, is not working on developing countries, on Brazil, where it's being imposed. It's been embraced in Brazil. So in some places it's been imposed by IMF agreements. In Brazil it has been embraced. Embracing it is the politics, the political economy of the impeachment, of Lava Jato, of Bolsonaro's election. And so I do want to say a little bit about what I understand this political economy to look like. This may look like a mess, but I'm going to try to explain it. And Stephen has seen this, and so have the folks in my politics of development class. But if we try to make sense of what has happened in Latin America over the last 25 years or so, we can talk about it in terms of factions of upper classes, factions of capital, and factions of popular sectors, or portions of the popular sector. Latin America in the 1960s, 1970s, up until the debt crises of the 1980s, really was pursuing a statist developmental policy, statist developmental strategy in which you had a coalition, a social coalition that I understand to be multinational capital, MNCs, state enterprises and state-directed industrialization strategy, and the industrial elite of Latin American countries, especially in Brazil. And there was some inclusion for labor, at least for organized labor for the formal sector. This is what the statist industrialization strategy of the 60s and 70s and into the 80s looked like in Brazil and in other parts of Latin America. Of course, the debt crisis broke apart that coalition and the set of policies that held this development strategy together and imposed or introduced a neoliberal development strategy. And that neoliberal development strategy, which was introduced in Brazil in the 1990s, not as severely as some other countries like Mexico, but still moved in that direction in Brazil, it represented a very different social coalition. A social coalition that brings together globalized finance, commodity exporters, those national capital interests that are able to survive in this liberalized and deregulated and open economy, pretty much large-scale national capital, monopoly capital. And there's some room for professional middle classes to claim some space in this sort of development model. The multinational companies, they remain part of this story. The industrial elite, less so, unless they really are part of that monopoly capital within these developing countries. So you have this sort of upper class coalition that really brings in internationalized actors, Brazilians who are connected to the international economy, adapted to an open, liberalized economy, and international capital as they see Brazil as a place to invest and to operate. The neo-developmentalist strategy, which was what I began with, the story of growth with inclusion, this was what the Workers' Party attempted to introduce in the 2000s, attempted to maintain that internationalized approach to development, resting on commodity exporters, as I mentioned, but still assuaging the worries of international capital, so maintaining a low-level inflation, maintaining monetary stability, the kinds of policies that keep international capital willing to invest in Brazil, they were kept happy. Commodity exporters are part of this coalition. Monopoly capital, and in fact some elements of Brazilian capital are brought in as the industrialization push of neo-developmentalist governments like the Workers' Party in Brazil emerge. But, as I mentioned, they really do reach out to those popular sectors. And so, I've colored them red, the Workers' Party is red, it's on the left. They reach out to those social movements with the social inclusionary policies like opening up universities and increasing participation, to labor in the informal sector by raising wages and extending social benefits. Even some benefits to popular sections in the rural areas, indigenous and peasants. But I will say that there's an inherent conflict between those commodity exporters and indigenous and peasant groups in the countryside. And so that's the most tenuous part of the popular sector as far as bringing them into this coalition. But with the collapse of the growth model that neo-developmentalism rests on, we're back in that neoliberal coalition. So this is what Rafael was emphasizing in terms of the neoliberal portion of the coalition backing Bolsonaro, represented by Paulo Guedes, the super minister of finance and planning and the economy. And so they now are representing the renewal of that attempt at this kind of upper class pact. But it is notable that the neoliberal coalition of the 1990s was electorally successful. They were able, having defeated inflation, and we're talking about hyperinflation, they were able to communicate to popular sectors, even if they weren't sort of formally part of their coalition, they were able to say, at least you can consume again. At least you don't have runaway inflation, and they could win elections during the 1990s. Bolsonaro's dependence on the military, the apparent appeal to fascist sort of policies, the use of the judiciary to penalize opponents, and this is what the Lava Jato represents to me, is really the representation of this lack of hegemony, the lack of an ability to attain consensus and political hegemony, political dominance in any other way than force, than using authoritarian techniques. And so that is what the version of neoliberalism that we see now, this combination of authoritarianism and upper class neoliberalism, is what the Bolsonaro government represents. And that's why I'm so worried about Brazil, because it can tilt even further in that authoritarian direction if the corruption scandals start to get close to him and to his political allies, and he says, you know what, the political allies that I have, they're useless anyway, so I'll use the tools that are available as far as the military and other authoritarian mechanisms. So we have to be vigilant, we have to keep our eye on this. Bolsonaro did win an election. So electoral victories are not impossible for this neoliberal coalition, but we look at the way in which that election was won. The judiciary excluded the most popular politician in Brazil, the leader of the Workers' Party, Lula, who had been president during the entire growth boom period. They took him out of politics. Rafael and I, 2.5 years ago, wrote an article, just a short little blog piece, talking about the impossible game. Brazil is falling into the impossible game, which is how people described Argentina in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. In the Argentina in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the Peronists won elections. The left labor-based party, the Peronists, won elections and couldn't be defeated in elections except by cheating. And so, when the left would win elections, the right would stage a coup or some other mechanism of removing the left from power. They would hold an election in which they excluded Perón from running. They would win with 35% of the vote, have an illegitimate government that couldn't get anything done. It would collapse. They would open up elections again to the Peronists who would win. They would stage a coup and repeat. Brazil is falling into this story in which the left had this party that was winning elections. The right couldn't stand it. They had to exclude the left candidate from winning and take power in a non-electoral form. And now we've got a government that doesn't have that kind of legitimacy that you get out of an election that's won fairly, and it's turning towards authoritarianism as a way of governing. So it's good that we have historians around to remind us that we should learn from these mistakes because nothing good comes of them. I'll end now by saying that, Brazil fits into a story. And so while it is important to know the day-to-day, the politics of what's going on in each of the countries of Latin America, what happens in Brazil is part of a story in Latin America. In 16 countries, over 34 elections from 1998 to 2018, the left won elections. I've got in boldface the countries where the left is still in government. Since 2014, only one election has been won by the left. Mexico last year. Mexico is an unusual case for lots of reasons. They had stolen the election from the left in a number of previous elections, and so now sort of the collapse of legitimacy of a government experiencing that commodity collapse, and a left government is in Mexico. But in any case, this is a story. A couple countries never had that left turn: Colombia, Guatemala, Dominican Republic, Panama. We see a series of electoral reversals. The right can win elections. I wish they would try. The right can win elections, and they did in Chile, in Argentina, in Peru, in El Salvador just this year, in Honduras, in Brazil this year, Haiti. So elections are a legitimating way of running politics. We ought to count on elections to kind of create governments and to identify our leadership. Unfortunately, there have been a number of non-electoral power grabs across Latin America. We've had coups in Haiti, Honduras, Paraguay. I think we should call the impeachment of Dilma a coup in 2016. We've had extremely flawed elections in Haiti, in Honduras, since the coup, in Brazil last year because of excluding the main candidate. Venezuela last year, I think we have to admit and recognize that Cuba also, they have elections. I don't know really what to call them, one-party elections. So we have left governments that are also running elections that really we have to question as far as the degree to which they add to democratic legitimacy in terms of presidencies. We got a number of attempted coups, one ongoing right now in Venezuela, the third attempt, two in Bolivia, one in Ecuador. We've had presidents fall in Guatemala and Peru for corruption scandals. There wasn't sort of a left-right dimension there because their politics are so messed up that you can't really identify the left and right. But what we see around this story is that democracy is really in trouble in Latin America. and it is in Brazil and it's across Latin America, that we are moving away from accepting the rules of the game. The rules of the game in which there's a degree of uncertainty around elections. If you lose, you accept the loss and you organize an opposition and advocate for your positions, but you accept that this is the way in which you select leaders and move forward. We appear to have moved away from that in Latin America, and that's especially worrying. So I'm going to close there and turn it over to Marco and eat my pizza, but hopefully there'll be plenty of time for questions and comments afterwards.
Let me see how this works.
Oh, so now I'm going to switch over. He showed me how to do it. If we have any trouble, we'll...
Okay, so...
Começa a botar o fio?
I put...
Bom, se
No, I read connected.
No, but conecta com o
that's
fio
one.
e assim eu
Okay.
tenho que
Okay, let me see.
brincar com isso.
Deixa.
Alcança?
Okay.
Give it. Agora sim.
Well, first of all, thank you for your patience and for being here. I'd like to take the opportunity to also congratulate Aaron and Rafael for the great work they have been doing here in the Latin American Center, and also for inviting me here to come and spend this cold winter in a so warm environment. It has been very kind from all of you, to me and my family. I will try to not repeat too much, but they covered basically all of what I had to say, and I will just try to add some personal points. One thing that we should remember is the timing, and one thing that I would like to add is that Bolsonaro's victory was not inevitable, and it was not overwhelming as we may think by this 2 big crowded month of his presidency. I'm a little bit more optimistic in that sense. In 2010, Dilma Rousseff was elected with a 56% in the runoff. Bolsonaro this year was elected with 55% of the popular voting. And we are 210 million people in the country, so half of the electorate voted for the Workers' Party. And these people cannot go anywhere. We are going to stay in the country. So defeated are not vanished. That's my point here. But we are coming out of a period of deep recession, the longest and deepest recession since the 80s in Brazil. And the recovery has been slow and enfeebled by the same neoliberal policies that Aaron was talking about. So we still have almost a quarter of our population unemployed or in the informal sector, and they didn't vote for Bolsonaro in the majority. Our political system is has many flaws, but it's a consensual one, and Brazil is too big to be controlled by just one political party. We do have 26 states. We do have more than 5,000 municipalities. We do have 51,000 local councillors. So from grassroots on, I believe that interests from the people, workers, peasants, and unemployed in big cities will also be heard and be active in resisting some of these policies, as it was the case during the 80s and going out of the so-called lost decade in the Latin American economy. But it remains to be seen, and I concede that right now the shape of our politics is not very promising. And going back to the more conjunctural, more specific aspects of Bolsonaro's victory, it was all about Lula, and the big elephant in the room was Lula. And he needed to be put out of the picture in order to a opposing candidate to be viable. And Lula had more than 40% of the voting preferences just 3 months ahead of the election, before the election. But Bolsonaro got elected, and as you can see, it was not an overwhelming majority in the whole country. Of course, the pink tide, or the red part of the country, are in the northeast, and they are not where the most important elites, capital owners, and financial elites are located, but they are strong in terms of controlling important political resources in the country. And this is the voting. Basically, what these two pictures show is that Haddad, the Workers' Party candidate, was voted by the poor, and Bolsonaro was voted by the better off in our society. Of course, there are exceptions. The Catholic vote went majorly to and the Catholics are 64% of the country, for the Workers' Party, and the evangelicals voted. They are 24%. They voted in the majority for Bolsonaro. So, and one aspect of our polity that is not very functional is that our political party system is very fragmented in a way that it's inconceivable in Mexico, or Argentina, or other parts of Latin America. We do have now 35 political parties able to run for elections in Brazil, and in the last election, 30 of them got seats in the lower chamber in the Congress, and 20 of them got seats in the Senate. So this fragmentation means that it would be hard for Bolsonaro to get a majority in the Congress by normal means of bargaining, pork, and conceding and building broad coalitions to govern. The biggest political parties, Bolsonaro party, it was basically non-existent before this election, and the Workers' Party lost some presence in the Congress, but retained the biggest amount, the greatest amount of seats. Together, they are only 10% of our, a little bit more than 10. None of them control more than 10% of our Congress. So, Bolsonaro chose to nominate a cabinet that has the lowest coalescence rate in the recent history in Brazil, which means that he is not relying upon political parties to govern. And he is refusing to conduct normal political bargains in the country. He himself has been a member of more than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 political parties over his 27 career. He couldn't care less about political parties and structures in Brazil, but that's why he was a sort of extreme right, out of the picture, burlesque candidate so far. And that's why he will never be comparable to Lula in Brazilian history. He has two ministers that hold most of the power in his cabinet. Jude Sérgio Moro was force behind this car wash operation, the big judicial investigation against corruption in Petrobras and the political system. He is basically cannot be dismissed by Bolsonaro. He brought with him to government all the support from the middle classes and stuff. And the economic minister, Paulo Guedes, that Rafael talked about, who represents the great capital and cannot be dismissed as well. And military folks. I will not I will refrain from develop more, but Rafael mentioned there are more than 100 military folks in different parts of the government, and they see themselves as the stabilizers for the political situation in Brazil. So there is no way the political agenda of Bolsonaro can advance in the country without conflict. And facing conflict, he is not very fond of democracy and the political, normal political bargaining. So he will try to break any kind of entanglement by using authoritarian tactics or authoritarian moves. And that's for sure. Right now, Paulo Guedes not only praised the Chicago Boys, but praised Pinochet regime as the model for Brazil. Combine authoritarian politics with very neoliberal policies at the bottom. But his agenda is also problematic from the point of view of the military, because he and also Moro need to take the military out of the reforming proposals they are doing. In the case of the politicians, Moro has agreed to left illegal campaign financing out of this new anti-crime package sent to the Congress. And Guedes agreed to left the military out of the pension reforms. So that's basically the game they are trying to play in order to get these two basic pieces of legislation that in the first month they, I think, will try to advance in the Congress. The pension reform and sort of hard stance on crime and put more people in jail in Brazil. I think they can succeed in Congress because of the very conservative and reactionary composition of National Congress, but I think it would not be easy for them to pursue. One first voting this month was related to a presidential decree trying to curb some of the transparency and right to information, Freedom of Information Act in Brazil. And Bolsonaro was defeated in Congress by his own political party, basically saying that, okay, you need to come up and discuss with us some of your propositions. So it is a possibility, but it's not a given thing that he will be able to prevail. And regarding foreign affairs, just to finish my point, this diplomat, Brazilian diplomat, he was promoted to ambassador just last year. He was virtually no one inside the foreign bureaucracy in Brazil, which is very strong and professional. He was not very well regarded by his peers, and he was appointed by the far-right guru of Bolsonaro, who lives here in Virginia, United States, Olavo de Carvalho, as a sort of new kid on the block. And he writes things as strange as Rafael was mentioning, that globalism is driven by cultural Marxism and is anti-human and anti-Christian. Trump is the best leader because he is restoring Western civilization values, which were challenged by nihilism. And so Trump is now the defender of the Illuminism, or something like that. And he lamented the criminalization of red meat, oil, and heterosexual sex. A guy writes these things and is the foreign minister of the 8th or 9th more important economy in the world. So I don't know how far he will be able to pursue his personal agenda of supporting Trump and supporting Netanyahu and supporting Viktor Orban, which is the new best friend from Bolsonaro, the Prime Minister of Hungary, which I think is the only government right now in the world that is a new fascist government opposed by a neo-Nazi party in the parliament. So those are the types Bolsonaro is in bed with, if you forgive my figure of speech. So, so far, some of this agenda has been put in place. Brazil was pulled out of the Migration Pact, not yet from the climate agreement, the Paris Agreement. But I think the most histrionic things will be curbed by the military and the agribusiness field. For instance, Bolsonaro campaigned against China, saying China was buying Brazil and he would be taught on China and following Trump's lead on the trade war. But after he got elected, the agribusiness and the commodity people in Brazil thought China is too important for us to play with. So stop. I think they will get along destroying Mercosur and all the regional organizations in Latin America, because those are not very strong in any way. As you saw this weekend, Colombia and Brazil are supporting the current Trump administration policy towards Venezuela very strongly, but the military already told that they will not be involved in a military invasion of Venezuela of any sort. So there is a limit on that. They will try to increase, and they thesis in favor of regime change in Venezuela as long as they don't have to die there. So that's the limit. And this is President Lula statue in Washington, D.C., in front of the Organization of the American States, and I don't think he will be removed from there, even after these 4 years of Bolsonaro's president. Thank you very much.
Great. So we've got plenty of time if folks want to ask questions, or we've got some very knowledgeable people here in the room who have their own thoughts, I'm sure. So questions or comments are welcome. I see one and then two. Yeah. If you have a question for a particular person, go ahead and take notes.
I have a general question for all three of you. I'm wondering what you think the effect is and could be or will be on academics and universities in Brazil, and peripherally related, what kinds of, I guess, what is the Brazilian government now under Bolsonaro? How are they dealing with the tragic loss of the National Museum late last year?
Why don't we take a second one? That's a great question for Mark, who works in a Brazilian university and has to worry very much about exactly that. But anyway, please.
Thanks. I've lived in Brazil. I'm going to marry Brazilian and go back in a few years, and I want to know if someone could touch on more the composition of the Senate and the Congress and its stability and the election.
Mm-hmm.
re-election of Bolsonaro.
Yeah.
Marco, do you want to take the education question at least and say what you're thinking about?
No. There are, I think, 4 groups in the Bolsonaro cabinet: the military, the neoliberal guys, the Lava Jato, the car wash people, and the fundamentalists, the Shia.
Taliban.
We call it the Taliban in Brazil. And the Ministry of Education is one of them. Not only the lady that was anti-feminist, but the Ministry of Education, who is a Colombian national, naturalized Brazilian, and he hates the Brazilian universities because he never got into one of them. And so it is something we are discussing that cannot be other than rancor, and he just hated. And so he's trying to pursue judicial investigations in all the universities, trying to paralyze the administration and cutting the funds and making the life of the academics very hard. And they expose those ideas of non-partisan school, which basically means that they are denouncing not only a global conspiracy of cultural Marxism, but a strong hegemony of Marxists in Brazilian universities that need to be rooted out, and they are stimulating a sort of new McCarthyism in the Brazilian universities. So it's very worrisome, and most of the academics and the Brazilian scientific associations are trying to resist that. For instance, by saying that they will not obey the determination for kids to recitate the Bolsonaro slogan. But I think it's very... And one of the comments after the museum caught fire was that it was, again, the responsibility of the left, because the museum was run by the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and it was a pity because it was the former house of the Brazilian emperor. And a couple of these people are monarchists. They are against the republic. They would like Brazil to become a monarchy again. So that's the sort of crazy people that are running important sectors of public policy. So I'm more concentrated on, because I think they are more dangerous for the future of the country, the neoliberals and the car wash people and the military in the long run. But in the short run, there is no doubt that the most high-profile agenda are run by these fundamentalists. And that will be a difficult battle, because they were able to get elected manipulating the sentiments of people in 3 aspects. By saying that corruption was a Workers' Party invention in Brazil, by saying that violence and crime was also a responsibility of the Workers' Party because it was too soft on criminals and they should be killed in the streets in order to prevent more violence and lose gun control and all that kind of stuff. But also by saying that the Workers' Party was trying to implement Venezuelan program in Brazil and trying to transform Brazil in a great Venezuela. I don't think it makes any sense, but it seems to be a trend in the world, saying that any progressive policies are trying to imitate Venezuela. The only thing close to Venezuela in Brazil is the opposition. It was the same model. But they were able to do that. So as long as they keep controlling the agenda and saying that this fundamentalist agenda is the topic of our conversation, the more deep public policies can be developed without much opposition. Well, I think we got too distracted by discussing everyday stupidity that comes out, and we should try to focus on the real dangerous public policies that are undermining the public education system and the scientific infrastructure in Brazil, and of course the economic and institutional base. I'm sorry to take too long. The Brazilian Congress, if I may, it is stable in the sense that the people get elected for 4 years or 8 years. So it was a 52% renewal. 52% of the Congress persons are newly elected. But they will stay there for 4 years. They have 4 years to learn and try. One thing is that all car wash and corruption investigations are related with a deep flaw in our campaign election laws to financing campaign and the size of our districts and the open list in our electoral system. And none of those problems were fixed by the political reform. So it gets to a point when combating corruption and fighting corruption becomes a threat to democracy in the sense that it destroys the political system and it allows people that are even worse than the so-called corrupt politicians to get into the office, and that's what militia means. If you recall, in Italy, during the Clean Hands operation against that brought down the political system in Italy, what was the outcome, the net outcome of that? 15 years of Berlusconi. And that's what's happening in Brazil now. So it's stable in the sense that they have 4 years, but nothing prevents right now that the situation will become even more unstable. So I would watch carefully before moving, follow the news.
Yeah. Well,
So I was looking at some of your slides, the fluctuations between the right and left governments in Latin America. And some of those, of course, lead on each other, you know, Chavez, Kirchner, Morales, and others. It seems to me that Bolsonaro is pretty isolated. And he's leaning mostly on Trump, who is extremely unpopular in Latin America as a whole. So where do you see this isolation will take him? Because that's something new. No,
And not even Duque in Colombia is like him.
That's a great question. Well, just to piggyback, and I to speculate, right? It's to be seen, but it was really interesting how he ran on this anti-China, similar to Trump, by the way, right? He really imported a lot of the rhetoric and style, even the campaign style, right, of Trump. And by the way, his son, his middle son, is now going to be working. We're going to be in the board with the one organization that the Bannon runs in DC. So and Bannon was not that directly involved, but was sort of informally advising them. So we still need to unpack a lot of these things, and the whole fake news that was also very important and played, I would say, decisive role in the election of Bolsonaro. We're still trying to make sense of that, and to my liking, there's very little, studies being done. But anyway, to really understand what happened there. But so it's this anti-China thing. Today, with Trump renegotiating the deals with China, it seems that China announced that there was some sort of announcement that it would go back to importing agri-business production in the Midwest from the U.S., which had stopped for several months and had really, been replaced by exports from Brazil. So now it's going back to being importing from the U.S., which of course will damage Brazil. And what a lot of people say now, see what happens? You want a bandwagon with Trump. Now Trump, of course, is in the big leagues, and he's going to, just kick you out of the whole conversation and just make a deal with China. And what's the point of this automatic alignment with the U.S.? So indeed, I mean, he's surprisingly, especially for the history of Brazilian diplomacy, more directly attempting at least to be aligned with the United States than countries that were the ones that for the last several decades were more aligned, like Colombia, Chile, Mexico, and trying to be, what we say in Brazil, is more Catholic than the Pope. Like, to prove himself even more worthy of being seen as an ally of Trump than than the actual allies. So it's trying too much of a deal, an effort to please Trump. A lot of people are saying similar to what especially Marco had said here, is that institutions and the bureaucracy has its own logic and its own weight, and it will curb, right? Like the foreign ministry is this huge machine and very professional and will curb, and so I usually it's like a point off too much of the curve, and we're not going to be able to implement all this rhetoric of. I mean, he praised Trump almost like a savior, right? I mean, it basically said Trump is the savior of Western civilization in a piece that he published. Right? This is not an internal conversation. But people are saying, well, the diplomats in the bureaucracy are going to slow him down, or are going to stop that, and we'll see what happens. I don't know. I think we are in uncharted territory. I think we really are. I don't think this, I mean, as loose and as sort of schizophrenic as this coalition is, it represents a new reality in Brazil that we're still trying to make sense. So both in the military and the foreign ministry, which is two main bureaucracies that sort of will slow down and curb, it's possible. The potential is there, but it's to be seen. I don't think in that sense history necessarily will be guaranteed that that will happen again.
May I just add?
Yeah,
please.
And it's making school. There is a candidate in Argentina, which now has, as Bolsonaro used to have 4% of the voting intentions, that is running on a Bolsonaro's platform. And support for democracy in Uruguay. There's support for democracy in Latin America is going down. So if crime, economic crisis, and corruption continue to be perceived as something, it turned out that it was captured by the left in Mexico, but the motivations were similar. And it may happen in different countries. But right now I agree with you that it's only Brazil, not even Colombia. President Duque is goes close to what Bolsonaro government is right now in Brazil. But it can change very rapidly. It depends on the if you have another international crisis, which is a possibility. Who knows? It may become a trend.
Caio in the back, yeah.
Back first.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Christine, do you wanna? Yeah, go ahead.
Ladies first.
No, she was first.
I frame this in an organized way. So I'm looking at what Dr. Schneider offered in your illustration of the trends from the left turns to the right electoral reversals to the non-electoral power patterns. And then there was an interior affairs slide that was up here. And I'm wondering, because it's both a question and comment. So under the non-electoral power trend, that all occurred, these coups, under the Obama administration, okay? So that's one thing to kind of compartmentalize. And so now I'm wondering, because we all know he was a centrist, so within his neoliberal centrist positionality, did he pave the way for now this uncharted territory of this lunatic, right? Sitting in the Oval Office right now. And then under the Interior Affairs slide, it said the motto, the political platform, it was about national identity and then God first. Oh, here it is. Brazil above everything and God above everyone. So that completely parallels with this administration's right-wing Christian evangelical medieval Christian revitalization, platform that they want to take, even in this country. And so now what I'm wondering, looking back at the slide, when the sanctuary movement was happening in the 60s and 70s in Latin America, and the neoliberals, the upper class came in and co-opted that languaging and that platform to seduce, right, the masses into thinking that this really was a platform for social inclusion, when inevitably, based on what you provided here, was this whole outline of how it went from statism to neoliberalism to neodevelopmentalism to now back to extreme neoliberalism. So the trend and the pattern is there, right? So now, what now? Now what?
Okay.
Yes.
The answers. Caio,
You were there, Mark.
and then let's hear it.
Mine is more like a kind of like hypothetical question, so bear with me. But it's kind of like the idea that behind this whole campaign, political campaign, last year in Brazil, there was a lot of like you said, of like fake news going on around social media, mostly around social media. And a lot of people would draw their conclusions about who to vote just from like simple conversations amongst familiars and friends, social media posts, and etc. And I'm from Brazil, and I witnessed that like with my friends and family like very clearly, and I'm sure you all as well. My question is more like the political system that is Brazil, which is everyone who's of legal age is required to vote, right? And basically here in the United States, it's more like an option, right? You go to vote if you want to. My question is, do you think, any of you, that Brazil should maybe like, again, this is hypothetical, but maybe should have a different kind of like system where people who are interested in whatever is going on politically should go vote instead of like demanding the whole population who basically a lot of people in Brazil don't have like a lot of like political understandings and education. So instead of like demanding all these people to go and like make a decision in like who to vote, have something more like here in the US where if you want to vote, you can go, but you're not required to. Again, this is very hypothetical.
So I'll say just a quick thought on solidarity, and I think it's a useful observation to note that what the progressive community around the world and in the U.S. learned in called the sanctuary movement and in solidarity with the movements against authoritarianism in Latin America over the 50s and 60s and 70s, that was a really important international movement at the time. And you're right in saying that it has been confused. It has been confused, and the language has been co-opted, and the organizations that organized that sort of solidarity have been disorganized. There was a lot of church organizing. There was kind of left social movement organizing. There was labor movement organizing, not as much in the U.S., but around the world. That was part of that solidarity movement in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And all of those social entities have been disorganized since then. And so mounting anything like an international solidarity to defend democracy in Latin America or here, it has to be rebuilt from the bottom up, and that is a real challenge. And if I might even just the question about re-election and Bolsonaro, I think that like what I think Marco was really arguing and Rafael meant was that for Bolsonaro to be defeated in his re-election is going to take really building from the ground up once again what used to be a vibrant civil society in Brazil. A vibrant civil society was what the Workers' Party originally ran on and had built over decades, in part in its own struggle for democracy in the 60s and 70s. The fruit of that was a very organized and interesting civil society.
Without industrial labor.
But they themselves demobilized it once they were in power. And that I think, we're seeing the impact of that. And so Bolsonaro can be defeated, but it won't be by the institutions of the Brazilian state, which I really do not trust. I don't even trust the institutions of the U.S. state. People say the CIA is going to save us from Trump. CIA hasn't saved anybody from anything. But Brazil much less. But in fact, there is a civil society in Brazil that had been organized, that had been dialed into politics. That is going to be what prevents a re-election. But it's an open question as to whether the Workers' Party or other left parties can reconstitute that civil society and bring them into politics because they lost practice. They lost practice. So the same thing can be said now about the international solidarity movement. We'll see. I don't know that we can get up to speed fast enough, but that's where it's going to have to come from. And one other observation, Marco was the first Brazilian professor who said, you know, can you find a postdoc for me? This Bolsonaro fellow is not somebody that I want to be in Brazil, at least at the very start. I need to just kind of have some distance and do what I can do. And so we made it happen. We got a great postdoc out of it and a great colleague. And there are others. There are other Brazilian professors who've been contacting me and saying, you know, things just are not pleasant at Brazilian universities right now. Is there a room for me in Denver? And so I think that's going to be a refrain over the next couple
And
years.
some people are being, it's not just a matter of choosing to. Some people have to flee the country because of threats, right? Some specific academics, some specific actually congressperson, right? Like Jean Williams, who is now in Germany, basically in exile. So this is not an overt dictatorship, but there are people in exile already. So and that's only 2 months in, so let's keep that in mind. So two things on the whole mandatory or non-mandatory voting, right? I actually philosophically am sympathetic to the idea of voting as a right, not as a duty, right? As a right, philosophically. But then we need to look at the history of Latin American countries that do have mandatory voting, such as Peru, Erica just left, or Brazil. In those countries, making voting mandatory was actually a way to make democracy more vibrant. So we need to balance the philosophical principle to the actual historical, unfolding of that. So in that sense, though sympathetic to philosophically, I do think it would be actually a grave mistake to not have voting be mandatory in Brazil. I don't think it would fix. I think the whatever, not one fix, but it could be improved by other ways, by actual voting and financial party financing reform and the way campaigns are run. And of course, also, the whole debate about fake news, how fake news are reshaping our politics globally. So I think it goes more through those aspects rather than just changing the law. It's too easy a fix. And when you really look at who's really supporting that in Brazil specifically, it's really the people that actually were very much in charge of what happened the last few years in Brazil, right? This is something. Well, why should poor people vote? They vote with their stomachs. That's really what they said, right? They vote with their stomachs because of the stipend that Lula provides to the poor people. They vote with their stomachs, as if you don't vote with your pockets, right? So why one is legitimate, why the other one is not legitimate? So there's a whole lot of hypocrisy going around with that. I'm not saying you are supporting that, but that conversation has been carried out like that, right? So I would just caution, that conversation. Yeah. What?
You mentioned that.
No, I just agree.
You mentioned that it wasn't inevitable that Bolsonaro got elected. I remember, even last summer, there's some speculation that Lula might be able to run. When he wasn't able to run, and Haddad was propped up for the PT. And if Lula had run, he very well could have won. What was lost? What groups were lost between Lula representing the PT and Haddad? And did they just go to Bolsonaro, or where was the discrepancy there? He not have enough momentum just as a last-minute candidate to really put up a fight, or what kind of happened there?
Yeah, that's good.
I don't think the electoral analysis has been run, but it was all those things, and there was a lot of abstention. So even though voting is mandatory, this was the highest level of abstention in.
What is mandatory is what is required is to go to the polls, not vote. First of all, and second, the penalties for not voting are very small. You just need to pay a fee or justify your absence, and so there is a lot of absence in that election. But there are the fake news aspect was important, and also, in my opinion, the timing was always kind of because the Workers' Party had to decide to maximize chances of getting Lula out of the jail and preserving the greatest amount of representatives elected in the National Congress, or trying to put up a fight against the. And everyone has underestimated Bolsonaro, mainly the right-wing parties, the established right that could have won the election if they were more patient in 2015. So they subestimated, and they were, because Workers' Party suffered some severe loss, but the right-wing party were how do you say, aniquilado?
Annihilated.
Annihilated in this election. And those guys and everyone was counting on a runoff between the traditional center-left and center-right parties, and the Bolsonaro went through that. I was kind of worried because of the deep tendencies in the Brazilian society regarding perceptions of corruption and crime as the big motivators for this voting. So after 3 years of political crisis, feeding into the economic crisis, people just got tired of the right-wing soft instance against the PT, and they tried to a stronger medication to get rid of. That was a factor as well. So Bolsonaro was able to amass 46% of the voting in the first run. Basically, all the voting perspectives converged to him in order to prevent a Workers' Party victory. So there's a lot of different aspects, but there's some tactical moves, wrong moves, or it's not wrong or right, you know. I think the Workers' Party were trying to survive and to preserve Lula's figure and to get as many representatives elected as they could. So that kind of enfeebled their presidential strategy. But Haddad did well at the end. He got 47% of the voting.
I have to step out. I'm going to leave you in the capable hands of these two Brazilians and Brazilianists, and you know, you can carry on. I apologize that I have to leave, but
It's
anyway,
not a good
thank
environment
you.
for having aliens doing anything this way.
All right, I won't report you. But anyway, thank you all for coming.
Well,
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you. Yes. And so again, I think we could wrap it up formally, but we can stay around and talk to so you more formally, unless someone has a specific question to make now. But otherwise, once again, thanks for coming. If there's more pizza there, please. Thank you very much.
Institutions of the Brazilian state, which I really do not trust. I don't even trust the institutions of the U.S. state. You know, people say the CIA is going to save us from Trump. The CIA hasn't saved anybody from anything. But you know, Brazil much less. But in fact, there is a civil society in Brazil that had been organized, that had been dialed into politics. That is going to be what prevents a re-election. But it's an open question as to whether the Workers' Party or other left parties can reconstitute that civil society and bring them into politics, because they lost practice. They lost practice. So the same thing can be said now about the international solidarity movement. We'll see. I don't know that we can get up to speed fast enough, but that's where it's going to have to come from. And one other observation, Marco was the first Brazilian professor who said, you know, can you find a postdoc for me? This Bolsonaro fellow is not somebody that I want to be in Brazil, at least at the very start. I need to just kind of have some distance and do what I can do. And so we made it happen. We got a great postdoc out of it, and a great colleague. And there are others. There are other Brazilian professors who've been contacting me and saying, you know, things just are not pleasant at Brazilian universities right now. Is there a room for me in Denver? And so I think that's going to be a refrain.
And some people are being, it's not just a matter of choosing to. Some people have to flee the country because of threats, right? Some specific academics, some specific, actually, congressperson, right? Like Jean Williams, who's now in Germany, basically in exile. So this is not overt dictatorship, but there are people in exile already. So that's only 2 months in, so let's keep that in mind. So two things on the whole mandatory or non-mandatory voting, right? I actually philosophically am sympathetic to the idea of voting as a right, not as a duty, right? As a right, philosophically. But then we need to look at the history of Latin American countries that do have mandatory voting, such as Peru, Erica just left, or Brazil. In those countries, making voting mandatory was actually a way to make democracy more vibrant. So we need to balance the philosophical principle to the actual historical, unfolding of that. So in that sense, though sympathetic to philosophically, I do think it would be actually a grave mistake to not have voting be mandatory in Brazil. I don't think it would fix. I think the whatever, not one fix, but it could be improved by other ways, by actual voting and financial party financing reform and the way campaigns are run, and of course also, the whole debate about fake news, how fake news are reshaping our politics globally. So I think it goes more through those aspects rather than just changing the law. It's too easy a fix, and when you really look at who's really supporting that in Brazil specifically, it's really the people that actually were very much in charge of what happened the last few years in Brazil, right? This is something, well, why should poor people vote? They vote with their stomachs. That's really what they said, right? They vote with their stomachs because of the stipend that Lula provides to the poor people. They vote with their stomachs, as if you don't vote with your pockets, right? So why one is legitimate and why the other one is not legitimate? So there's a whole lot of hypocrisy going around with that. I don't know, I'm not saying you are supporting that, but that conversation has been carried out like that, right? So I would just caution, that conversation. Yeah.
What?
You mentioned that.
No, I just agree.
You mentioned that it wasn't inevitable that Bolsonaro would get elected. I remember, even last summer, there's some speculation that Lula might be able to run. When he wasn't able to run, and Haddad was propped up for the PT. And if Lula had run, he very well could have won. What was lost? What groups were lost between Lula representing the PT and Haddad? And did they just go to Bolsonaro, or where was the discrepancy there? He not have enough momentum just as a last-minute candidate to really put up a fight, or what kind of happened there?
Yeah, that's good.
I don't think the electoral analysis has been run, but it was all those things, and there was a lot of abstention. So even though voting is mandatory, this was the highest level of abstention in.
Yeah, what is mandatory is what is required is to go to the polls, not vote, first of all, and second, the penalties for not voting are very small. You just need to pay a fee or justify your absence, and so there's a lot of absence in that election. But there are the fake news aspect was important. And also, in my opinion, the timing was always kind of, because the Workers' Party had to decide to maximize chances of getting Lula out of the jail and preserving the greatest amount of representatives elected in the National Congress, or trying to put up a fight against the and everyone has underestimated Bolsonaro, mainly the right-wing parties, the established right that could have won the election if they were more patient in 2015. So they subestimated, and they were, because Workers' Party suffered some severe loss, but the right-wing parties were, how do you say, annihilated in this election. And those guys and everyone was counting on a runoff between the traditional center-left and center-right parties, and the Bolsonaro went through that. I was kind of worried because of the deep tendencies in the Brazilian society regarding perceptions of corruption and crime as the big motivators for this voting. So after 3 years of political crisis, feeding into the economic crisis, people just got tired of the right-wing soft instance against the PT, and they tried to a stronger medication to get rid of. That was a factor as well. So Bolsonaro was able to amass 46% of the voting in the first run. Basically, all the voting perspectives converged to him in order to prevent a Workers' Party victory. So there's a lot of different aspects, but there's some tactical moves, wrong moves, or it's not wrong or right, I think the Workers' Party were trying to survive and to preserve Lula's figure and to get as many representatives elected as they could. So that kind of enfeebled their presidential strategy. But Haddad did well at the end. He got 47% of the voting.
I have to step out. I'm going to leave you in the capable hands of these two Brazilians and Brazilianists, and you know, you can carry on. I apologize that I have to leave, but
It's
anyway,
not a good
thank
environment
you.
for having aliens doing anything.
All right, I won't report you. But anyway, thank you all for coming.
Well,
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you. Yes. And so again, I think we could wrap it up formally, but we can stay around and talk to so you more formally, unless someone has a specific question to make now. But otherwise, again, once again, thanks for coming. If there's more pizza there, please. Thank you very much.